We're in Strathroy in southwestern Ontario, and today the town is going to unveil a statue to a local boy made good. The man they are honoring was an amateur soldier in 1914 and became the greatest general of the Great War. A man with unparalleled victories. If you don't know who he is, you're not alone.
General Sir Arthur Currie was a natural leader, a brilliant general and a giant of a man who changed the course of Canadian history.
This statue is a heartfelt tribute by his hometown, and that is appropriate, for Arthur Currie was the most famous Canadian of his time. We are going to go back to Europe, and we're going to find the battlefields and the places where Arthur Currie won his great battles and where he became the foremost general of the Great War. And we're also going to find out why he was forgotten. I'm military historian Norm Christie. I've been touring the old Western Front for 30 years. By visiting the famous and not so famous cemeteries and battlefields, you'll get a unique perspective on the war and the men and women who fought it on the Great War Tour. This is the first leg of our journey into the life of Sir Arthur Currie. He's one of our most famous people, and this is the Currie homestead. Wow, this house has seen better days. Let's see what it's like inside. Wow. Paint's on the walls, broken glass everywhere. What a mess. It's hardly a fitting monument to a great man. It's hard to imagine that Arthur Currie spent his first 18 years in this house. In fact, this staircase looks original. You can well imagine a young Arthur running up and down these stairs as a little boy. Arthur Currie's grandparents emigrated here from Ireland in the 1830s, and they were two of the original pioneers of this area. Currie himself was born in this house in 1875, and he lived here for about 20 years. But the change in his life came after his father died when he was only 15. He no longer had enough money to go to university. So like many young men, he chose to go west to seek his fame and fortune. When Arthur Currie moved out to Victoria, British Columbia, he first became a teacher, and he did that for a while, but it just wasn't lucrative enough. So he got involved in insurance sales, then he got involved in real estate, and he was reasonably good at this. But where he really excelled was as an officer in the Canadian militia. Currie joined the militia in the 1890s. A lot of businessmen did this to increase their political contacts, to add to their business. However, a lot of them didn't have a natural affinity for war. Arthur Currie did, and within 10 years, he rose to become lieutenant colonel of a garrison artillery militia regiment. In 1914, with the outbreak of the First World War, all these militia officers had to stop playing at war, for now it was the real thing. And for Arthur Currie, he would find his greatest challenges on the bloody battlefields of the Great War.
All my men in my 1st Division are from the West. Hearty men from the plains, the interior of BC, and the coastal cities. They will fight like Billy be damned.
We're retracing Arthur Currie's first steps in the Great War from early 1915. We're heading towards the city of Ypres in Belgium. Ypres is a beautiful medieval city, but already in 1915, it has been severely scarred by the war. The Allies fought desperately to keep Ypres because it was the last bastion defending the Channel ports. This is Ypres, Belgium, and this is the first important location in Arthur Currie's war. In mid-April 1915, 20,000 inexperienced and enthusiastic men of the 1st Canadian Division marched through the Grand Place here, out to the front line. Within days, they'd be fighting for their lives. This farmer's field is east of Ypres, Belgium, and we're standing on what were the front lines of the 1st Canadian Infantry Division, commanded by Sir Arthur Currie. The salient itself had been formed in 1914, and it was a dangerous bulge in the Allied line. They were surrounded by the Germans on 3 sides, and they could pour artillery on them from all those different positions. But Ypres had a huge propaganda and morale purpose, and the salient was very important and had to be held at all costs. So when the Canadians moved in here, it was quite an honor. Arthur Currie had done very well in the Canadian militia. He became the commanding officer of a garrison artillery unit in Victoria. And of course, by 1912, he thought his militia career was over. But encounters with Sam Hughes, who was then the Minister of Militia, made him stay in the militia and ultimately become the commander of the 50th Gordons, which was another Highland Canadian militia regiment. When war broke out in 1914, he had a big decision to make. He had some business troubles in Victoria. He wasn't sure whether he wanted to get involved into the great adventure, which became the Great War, but he was convinced by Sir Sam Hughes to take on the job as one of the brigadiers. So here you have a man with very little or no battlefield experience coming into a situation where he's going to have to face the Germans. In mid-April, Currie's 2nd Brigade came into this position, and Arthur Currie came down to inspect it, and he didn't like what he saw. He didn't see complete trenches. He saw little discontinuous half-mooned entrenchments. There was no barbed wire, and there was dead bodies everywhere. And he immediately told his men to dig in, to get ready. Already they were receiving rumors of a German attack.
There is an attack coming, they say, expected at night to be preceded by the sending of poisonous gases. Heavy shelling up to midnight, but no attack.
But he also noticed something very interesting. Behind the Canadian line was a very large ridge. And he automatically perceived this as the backbone to the Canadian position. So he went up there to inspect it.
We are not aware of actual fighting conditions, which can only be guessed at. One could learn it from books, but I knew that the rest was not to be learned from any book. I had to find out for myself, and if I could, master it.
This is the high point on Gravenstaffel Ridge, and when Arthur Currie came up here, he immediately saw how important it was. You can see the Germans were over in Poelcapelle. His front lines were midway in the field over here, and he could see Ypres only a few kilometers away. On his own initiative, he chose to create a defensive position here, a fallback position, just in case the Germans attacked. And within 2 days, the Germans attacked.
The 3rd Brigade original trenches are undergoing terrific bombardment. Reports of shells giving off stupefying fumes being used by the enemy.
This is the Brooding Soldier, and it's one of the most impressive monuments on the Western Front. It commemorates Canada's actions during the Second Battle of Ypres, April 1915. Thousands of people visit the monument, but very few realize you get an incredible view of the battlefield by walking over to the northwest corner. On April 22nd, 1915, the Canadians were to the right of this road, and the men in this line belonged to the 3rd Brigade, commanded by Turner. To his right was Currie's 2nd Brigade, and to his right was the British Army. So when the gas was released in this position, it only really affected Turner's brigade, and the breakthrough exposed Turner's brigade to enfilade fire. His men reacted very quickly, and they tried to seal the gap on the 22nd, and on the 23rd, later attacks tried to seal more of the gap. But in the meantime, Currie's men were not engaged for the first couple of days. They were bystanders watching the action, and of course this was very disconcerting because the Germans were definitely breaking through.
I moved into a long, low farmhouse, Pond Farm, that had been damaged by enemy shells. I saw a great many French soldiers, a few of whom were wounded, come running past Pond Farm, crying that all was lost and the Germans were coming.
This is Pond Farm, and it was Arthur Currie's advanced headquarters during the Second Battle of Ypres. It was on the front line for 4 years, and there's plenty of World War I relics here. So you grew up on Pond Farm?
Yeah, I grew up here, and we found a lot of World War stuff because of my father, because he drives here with his tractor and his plow.
Right.
And that's the reason why we find all that stuff, and I wanted to know what it was, and I could not throw it away, or I could not sell it, so I said, oh, I will start a collection, and it's a collection from 11 years, something like that.
Wow. This little collection here, this is, like, to me, an indication of how much shell fire went on here.
Yes.
Now, this area, Pond Farm, was on the front lines for basically 4 years.
Yes, yes.
So you had everybody shooting at this place.
Yeah.
And you speculate there must have been hundreds of thousands of shells fired in this vicinity.
At the beginning in 1914, the Germans were here. They demolished the farm, the roof was gone. Then in 1915, it was a Canadian headquarters. Then it was with the gas attacks.
So you found a few shrapnel balls as well in your time. This is your bucket of shrapnel balls.
That's a collection since I was very young. I think since my 8 or 9 years old.
And you still collect them?
When you're driving on the tractor and I see one, I will stop, yes.
Okay. What is your favorite piece that you found so far?
This is a German wallet.
Oh, wow.
It's too fragile to open it,
Right.
but there's money inside.
Wow.
Yeah. I think I will take an X-ray.
Oh, that'd be interesting.
Then I can see how many cones are inside. Yeah.
Wow. That's a neat one.
That's very special.
So you like the personal effects?
Yes, yes.
We're interested in Arthur Currie. So we're talking about the Canadians in 1915 here.
Yes.
Because we know this was his advanced headquarters. He had another one behind, and this is where he got caught up with the gas attack, which of course took place here. And Gravenstaffel Ridge, of course, is just beyond your farm.
Let's go outside. The land here has never been plowed before because it's too dangerous. There's too much munition and too much concrete here in this land. And if we would drive here with our tractor, we would harm our machine. So, yeah.
So really, you haven't touched this thing for 100 years.
Yeah, that's
100 years. It's been like pasture land.
Yeah.
So with Currie, what happened is he's here and he's getting the reports when the gas is launched.
Yes.
But the gas is all launched over there.
Yeah.
So as everybody's running away over there and their fighting is over here, his guys are still in the line. But just prior to the battle, he had gone up the Gravenstaffel Ridge, fortified locality, see the high point, and then once the action starts, he's here going, where is everybody? Where's my flank? What's happening? Because now he can hear the Germans behind him.
I could send no help to my front lines. My reserves were all used up. The situation was so serious, I told Colonel Lipsett that if it was impossible for him to hold on, he had my permission to retire.
His men are still up in there, and they're there for another 2 days. So he actually leaves his post. He goes back in to try to find the British general.
As soon as I explained to General Snow that there was apparently a gap between the left of my 8th Battalion and the 3rd Brigade troops, he shouted at me and asked me how I dared to allow a gap to occur. General Snow roundly abused me and told me to get out, shouting at me to give them hell, give them hell. I've never heard a more stupid remark.
But he leaves his command under a really good guy, really good general, Louis Lipsett.
Colonel Lipsett urged me to go and get in touch with this counterattacking force, point out the situation to them, and direct them.
He comes back, and finally they get evacuated back over the Gravenstaffel Ridge.
Oh my God.
But from here, because the communication was so bad, he couldn't even figure out what was happening anywhere, because they're pulling out, the Germans are attacking again, there's more gas. It's quite remarkable. And Currie had never been in a battle before. It was his first battle. This is Perth Cemetery near Ypres, and it contains the graves of 50 men of Arthur Currie's 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade, all killed at Gravenstaffel Ridge. On April 22, 1915, the Germans launched the gas attack against the French and broke through. But 2 days later, they launched a major attack on the Canadians using gas and infantry reserves, and this time they tried to encircle the Canadians by driving up Gravenstaffel Ridge.
The rifle, machine gun fire, and shell fire was terrific. We can only hang on. Our fellows had absolutely no protection, but they had stout, willing hearts and a firm determination not to give in. They preferred death to retreat or dishonor.
Currie's decision to build a defensive perimeter here actually saved the day, and they were able to stop the German attack. It is remarkable that a man who had never been in battle before, and after only 1 month at the front, could make such an important decision. He used his intuition and common sense, and it was a sign of things to come. We're on the road to Festubert, and Festubert was the 2nd major battle fought by the Canadians in the First World War. And it's one where Arthur Currie really got a taste of British generalship. This nondescript field is the battlefield of Festubert. On May 15, 1915, British and Indian troops attacked here against the German positions across this field. Serving with the British Army at Festubert was 28-year-old Walter Young of the 8th Battalion, the London Regiment, 47th Imperial Division.
The village of Festubert lay in ruins. The houses, for the most part, were just heaps of stone and debris. Broken pieces of wall was all that remained of the church, but the crucifix was still standing.
Within days, they had suffered thousands of casualties, and the Canadians, who were waiting in reserve, were ordered to the attack. When the Canadians came down to Festubert, you have to remember they had lost half their infantry in the Second Battle of Ypres, and they'd only just grabbed 3,000–4,000 reinforcements from the depots and arrived here. They were almost green battalions once again. So when Currie got here, and he must have seen what a mess this was, the British didn't have enough artillery, and these British and Indian troops were slaughtered in these fields. So when the Canadians' turn came, and when Currie had to attack across these fields, his flank was not protected, he didn't know exactly where he was going, and he had all green troops. The water table here is so high that the trenches are built above the ground with sandbags. And this area would have been riven with walls of sandbags going back to the German line. In the earlier fighting, the shelling, of course, had destroyed all these sandbag walls, and now this was a completely nondescriptive area. There was no way of telling one position from the other.
Festubert is a marshy district and difficult to dig trenches in. The front line we took over was mostly a barricade of sandbags. I didn't like the look of the place somehow.
When the 3rd Canadian Brigade was committed, they captured Canadian Orchard. And then following up that attack, they ordered Currie's 2nd Brigade to move forward and attack a position called K5 and M5. These are points on this line of sandbags that didn't even exist anymore.
In an afternoon reconnaissance, Brigadier General Currie had been unable to identify his objective. The Festubert Trench map was full of inaccuracies. Furthermore, it was printed upside down.
When Currie saw the position, he didn't want his men to attack. There was just no chance for success. He wanted a postponement so he can reconnoiter the position and come up with an appropriate plan.
A shallow communicating ditch provided the only semblance of a covered approach to his target. Currie therefore asked for the attack to be postponed until the next day.
And he was overruled, and the attack went in to heavy casualties.
In opposing the attack, this was my first difference with the High Command. But still, I was ordered to make the attack.
General Alderson ordered the 2 Canadian brigades in the line to assault. It was broad daylight when the attack started. It was the same story of men advancing magnificently against a hail of machine gun bullets. Half the force advancing across open ground towards K5 was quickly cut to pieces.
The German guns started, and for the first time, we experienced the full fury of a modern bombardment. All day, they pelted us mercilessly, never pausing for a minute. The shells were falling 3 and 4 at a time all around us. All we could do was to crouch down. It seemed as though they wanted not merely to kill us, but to blow us to pieces.
I'm looking for relics of the Battle of Festubert, and these fields are usually full of tramp metal, shrapnel balls, and bullets. This is just sitting on the surface. This is the base of a shrapnel shell. They were always firing shells, so you can speculate that there'd be 10,000 shells fired off in this field.
The storm of shells was unabated. The supplies seemed inexhaustible. For 18 hours, we endured this. One man was crying piteously, "Help me, somebody." A bomb had exploded in his face, blinding him. He died later. And then occurred the most terrific thunderstorm I've known. It was as though this scene of violence and bloodshed had brought upon us the wrath of God.
That same morning, General Haig visited General Alderson's headquarters to express dissatisfaction at the failure of the Canadian attacks and to insist that the Germans be driven from their positions.
At 2:30 a.m. on May 24, 1915, Currie's brigade attacked. Within half an hour, they had pushed the line forward, but casualties were heavy.
You can't know how proud I am of my brigade. They've been tried in the fiercest possible tests and have run true.
The Battle of Festubert ended May 24, 1915, and it cost British, Indian, and Canadian troops 15,000 dead and wounded. But Arthur Currie had learned a great lesson. These professional soldiers, these British generals, were very capable of making terrible mistakes.
The British commander sent us a message. "Well done, 2nd Brigade." While such messages are deeply appreciated, they do not console. I now know better than ever that I was right. At Festubert, I lost 53 officers and 1,200 men.
We're driving down a country road in France, like the one taken by the Canadians and Arthur Currie in 1916. I'm heading towards the city of Albert in the region of the Somme. A lot had changed since 1915. The Canadians were now 3 divisions strong, and Arthur Currie was in command of the 1st Canadian Division.
It is a great honor to be considered capable of commanding what is universally regarded as one of the best fighting divisions in the British Army. I pray that God will always guide me to do the right thing at the right time.
There had also been a change at the head of the Canadian Corps, and now the Canadians were commanded by Julian Byng. Julian Byng and Arthur Currie immediately struck up a very special relationship. They had a common sense of camaraderie, and this would lead to very big things in the future. And now the Canadian Corps, 60,000 strong, was making its way south to the Somme, to one of the bloodiest battles of the Great War. We're in Pozieres village on the Somme, and from here you can see 2 monuments reflecting the sacrifices of that great battle. In front of us is the 1st Australian Divisional Memorial, and it honors the Australians killed at Pozieres in 1916 and throughout the war. And beyond, you can see Thiepval, which is a memorial to the missing. By the end of August 1916, the British Army was exhausted. They had used up their own men in many futile attacks. They'd used up the Australians, the New Zealanders, and the South Africans, and now it was the Canadians' turn. When the Canadians were called down here at the end of August, it was Arthur Currie's 1st Division that came into the line near here. And what they found was complete destruction. The village of Pozieres had ceased to exist, and there were corpses everywhere from many failed attacks. And it was Currie's men that were about to be thrown into the battle.
Absolutely continuous shelling night and day. We beat off about 3 or 4 attacks a night. Small affairs of about a platoon each. In the last 23 days, the men have been 18 days in the line, 4 days marching, and 1 day rest. They are very tired, but they have done very well indeed.
This is Adinak Military Cemetery north of Courcelette. And from here, you get an incredible view of the attack on Regina Trench from October 8, 1916. Regina Trench ran across the fields just in front of the cemetery for another 1.5 miles in the other direction. And it was Arthur Currie's 1st Division that were supposed to make the assault and take the trench. The problem was, advanced warnings indicated that the artillery bombardment had failed to cut the barbed wire in front of the German trench. Currie had advised headquarters that the preparations were insufficient for the attack, but nonetheless, the general in charge, Hubert Goff, had ordered it forward, and the men attacked.
It was hell, proper hell. Our casualties very severe and trenches very bad. What none of us like is sitting still and getting blown to pieces.
Once the attack started and the men crossed no man's land, they had no choice but to try to get through the wire. And there's many stories of the men trying to cut the wire as they went through, or men throwing themselves down on the wire while other men ran over them. And you have to think the German machine guns are trained on these positions. So once you got stuck, once you slowed down, once you missed your artillery barrage, you were a sitting duck. The attack failed along the Miramount Road over here, and on the eastern side, his battalions got into Regina Trench and secured their positions. The German techniques meant that they were going to counterattack down the length of the trench. So if you did not secure a wide area, they could counterattack and drive you back. On the 8th, they took the trench in this area. On the 9th, they had to evacuate it, and Currie's attack failed. It was one of only 2 battles where Arthur Currie's men did not achieve their objectives. By the time the Canadians withdrew from Regina Trench on October 9, 1916, their casualties were enormous. And there's more than 400 of these men buried in Adinak Military Cemetery. The majority are from Arthur Currie's 1st Division. This is Howard Letty, 3rd Battalion from Toronto. He was killed October 8, 1916. Another one here, William Logan, 16th Battalion Canadian Scottish. He was killed at Regina Trench, almost in this position. And here's the grave of Major Sidney Gilroy, 13th Battalion Black Watch of Canada, Canadian Infantry. Killed in action at Regina Trench, October the 8th, 1916. The Battle of the Somme cost the Canadians 24,000 casualties. That's killed, wounded, and missing. The men were demoralized by the heavy losses for such a small gain. But they weren't the only ones. General Currie and General Byng were also disturbed by the impetuous attacks, the lack of preparations. They decided on the next sector they were going to get it right. And that next sector was Vimy Ridge. In mid-October 1916, Arthur Currie and the Canadians were ordered north. We're following their path from the Somme to the village of Equave near Vimy Ridge. Vimy had a reputation of being the most formidable German sector on the Western Front. This was the old chateau at Equave, and in 1917, it was Arthur Currie's 1st Divisional headquarters. Today, the chateau is gone, it's burnt down, and all we have are the gates and the wall around it. But in 1917, this was a hive of activity. This is where the 1st Canadian Division went in and out of the line, and this is where Currie and Byng planned Vimy operations. The Somme had been a disaster, and they developed a healthy disrespect of the British generalship. What they found is the attacks were impetuous, there wasn't enough artillery, and they were driven ahead without the proper planning. When they were given the objective of Vimy Ridge, they worked together to develop a system by which they could guarantee success. That meant organization, training, and execution. This time, they were going to do it right. This time, they were going to plan it, and they're going to win.
Every feature of the German defense was studied and definite plans made for the overcome of every obstacle. The men had rehearsed the attack many times, and each and every man knew exactly where he was going in the attack and what he was going to do when he got there.
In the trenches, Currie proceeded at a great pace, sometimes on his hands and knees in the mud. He made a point of seeing not only the senior officers, but the company and platoon commander and the rank and file. He made constant inquiries about the condition and welfare of the troops under his command. He had a cheery and encouraging remark for all ranks and was obviously a great favorite with the men.
The resourcefulness, the self-reliant initiative of the Canadian is most marked. These are men accustomed to solving their own problems every day. Quickly and accurately, they size up the situation and find the solution. The attack was carried out exactly as planned. Stiff fighting, every battalion doing equally well. The 1st Division penetrated over 6 miles into the enemy's defenses, capturing all our objectives. None went further. None killed more Germans than the 1st Division.
Here are a few relics of the Battle of Vimy Ridge. You can see shrapnel balls, and this is a nice find. This is an 18-pounder fuse cap. And when we clean it up, we may find it was fired by a Canadian gun. And down here is the 1st Division Memorial, raised to honor their comrades killed in the Battle of Vimy Ridge.
The victory of the Canadian Corps at Vimy Ridge is universally regarded as the finest feat of arms performed by British troops in the whole war.
You get a great view from up here. You can see Arras, and you can see the battlefield of the 1st Canadian Division, April 9, 1917. Currie's division had performed brilliantly. They were on schedule, they took all their objectives, and they smashed the German army. The overall victory at Vimy brought acclaim and promotions. And the first promotion was Julian Byng being sent to command the 3rd British Army. Arthur Currie got knighted, but by Byng's movement, there was a vacancy at head of the Canadian Corps, and there was some debate as to who was going to get it. In early June 1917, Arthur Currie moved his headquarters here from La Targette, and it was much better accommodations. This is Chateau d'Ac. Chateau d'Ac is a beautiful 19th century chateau. And you can see here evidence of the Great War. They used this First World War helmet as a planter for the last 100 years. It was here that changes came to the Canadian Corps. Julian Byng was promoted to command the 3rd Army, and that left a vacancy. And there was some debate as to who was going to get it, Arthur Currie or Richard Turner in England. In the end, pressure from the Canadian government, pressure from Julian Byng, and pressure from Douglas Haig made Arthur Currie commander of the Canadian Corps. General Currie dedicated this monument to the Canadian Corps Artillery for Vimy operations in 1918. Thousands of soldiers lined the streets here, and of course this area was a barren wasteland. There was nothing here but the monument. In fact, that's one of the most interesting things about it, is that the only thing that's the same since 1918 is this monument. Everything else has grown up all around it. General Currie was over here, and Canon Scott was beside him, and there's an iconic photograph of the two of them unveiling the monument. The monument is ringed with massive shells from the garrison artillery, so it's appropriate Arthur Currie should unveil it because he was a militia commander of a very big garrison artillery battery in Victoria before the war began. His use of artillery throughout the war was very specific, and he always made maximum use of his heavy guns.
Oh, they put me in the army and they handed me a pack. They took away my nice new clothes.
In the fall of 1917, the Canadians, now under the command of Sir Arthur Currie, are ordered north to return to Belgium. We're following in their footsteps from Vimy to a position near the village of Passchendaele in the Ypres salient. The Ypres salient was really a bulge in the German line, and the problem was any troops stationed here were vulnerable to heavy artillery fire coming from all three directions. We're going to head to the jump-off point, which is sort of one of the great ironies of modern times versus the Great War, because the jump-off position is now a cheese museum. This is the Cheese Museum, and it'd be a perfect place for a Canadian military museum because one of our greatest battles of the Great War were fought just outside this building. This is the Passchendaele battlefield. It's the most infamous battle of the Canadians during the Great War. Today, this is really quite pretty. Little farmland, but this little territory was almost impassable to an army in 1917. The shelling had been so severe that all this area was reduced to a lunar landscape of mud and shell holes, dead bodies. The towns and villages had been reduced to rubble. Passchendaele offensive, or Third Battle of Ypres, started July 31st, 1917. And there was an attack launched by two British armies. They had a little bit of success at the first couple days, and then the rain had come in, the shell came in. And after that, it was just a bloody mess. They had not achieved any of their objectives. British casualties and Australian casualties had numbered over 250,000. So they had to show something for all those losses. And now it's getting October 1917, the winter's coming, the offensive's going to have to end. Haig wants to show some form of victory. And that victory is going to be the taking of Passchendaele village and the high point on Passchendaele Ridge. So the Canadians, with their record of success and the fact they're at full strength, they were able to make the move, meant that Currie was going to get the call. But of course, Currie didn't want the call. Currie had only taken over the Canadian Corps in June 1917. And his first action, Hill 70, he had already disagreed with his British superiors and actually got them to change their plans. For Passchendaele, it was his second major battle, and he'd also disagreed with the British High Command. But this time they had been able to put enough pressure on him to force him to bring the Canadian Corps up to Passchendaele, which to Currie was not worth the casualties.
Passchendaele. What's the good of it? A name for a lot of mud and grief for a lot of crack-brained fools in London to play with. What do they care? Do they get killed, or wounded, or choked in the mud? Let the Germans have it, keep it, rot it. It isn't worth a drop of blood.
Once he got here, he put his people in place. He did the reconnaissance of these areas. He set up his transport. He became ready for the attack. He got his artillery in place, typical Arthur Currie, get the plans in, get the men up. But of course, it was a very different battlefield. And it was for the man, really, I'd say in the trenches, but there weren't hardly any trenches, in the shell holes, that had to make the difference in this battle. And it was really the spirit of the Canadian Corps, along with Currie's planning, that made Passchendaele a success. Arthur Currie could never be coerced. This is something about his character going back to when he was a young man. He would always voice his opinion against authority, even if it was going to get him in trouble. He had shown this against Sam Hughes in 1912, and he showed it against the British in 1917. He would make his argument, he would get very animated about it, he would fight with them, even though he was at a lower rank. Now, he could do this because he was a Canadian general, He didn't belong to the British Regular Army, and he would make his points as strongly as he possibly could. And at Passchendaele, he did everything he could to stop the Canadians coming up here for an action he thought was a waste.
The Canadian Corps will not fight under General Gough. My own lack of confidence in Gough comes from our experience with him in the Somme in 1916. I don't want to repeat that again. I carried my protest to the extreme limit, which I believe would have resulted in my being sent home had I been other than the Canadian Corps commander. I pointed out to General Plummer what the casualties were bound to be, 16,000. And I asked if a success would justify the sacrifice. Plummer was sympathetic, but there was nothing he could do. My orders are clear, he shrugged. The Commander-in-Chief, General Haig, has called on us to do a big job. It is going to be your business to make the final assault and capture the ridge. It has got to be done. You will not be called upon to advance, as you never will be, until everything has been done that can be done to clear the way for you. After that, it is up to you, and I leave it up to you with confidence.
Haig came up to him and said, "I'll tell you later why you have to do this." There was a mutiny in the French army. Morale on the British side was going down, and they needed some victory at Passchendaele to keep the war going. One general, Hubert Gough, was notorious for being an impetuous general and one who drove his men into disaster. And a lot of the failure that took place around Passchendaele was under Gough's command. Plummer was the other general, and these are both British Regular Army officers, and Plummer was a far better general. Neither one of them could actually deliver Passchendaele. They were exhausted by the time the Canadians came around, and the Canadians, under Currie's leadership, took the position. And in the end, that's what matters. It's not your logic going in, it's whether or not you can win. And that's one thing that Arthur Currie always did. He won. Arthur Currie was a master of preparation. He always made sure everything was aligned before he launched his attack. He was against all forms of impetuous attack. He had seen them on the Somme. He wasn't for them. You had to be ready, get your men in, and give them the best opportunity to move forward. And this is what he did. His artillery was in place. His COs were very confident individuals. He knew what they were going to carry on for him. They knew that they could get the job done. There's an overall confidence, not only in Currie, but in the concept of the Canadian Corps. And a lot of this was set up with Currie's mentor, Julian Byng. But Currie was methodical. He put everything in place so his men would have the most advantage in the attack.
October 30th, 1917. 12th Brigade on right got their objectives, including Crest Farm, on time. 3rd Division on left, Harts did extraordinarily well, taking Michel after very heavy fighting. Heavy casualties held up at First Farm. Source Farm and Vapor Farm captured. Imperials on flank failed again, as they did on the 29th of October attack. Our troops fought very hard all afternoon, taking one pillbox after another, and at night were able to report all objectives in our hands. From one row of pillboxes, they took 18 machine guns. It was one of the finest performances which the Canadians have yet done.
One of the most important strengths of the Canadian Corps was the coordination between its artillery and its infantry during an attack. Some of the most famous photographs of the Battle of Passchendaele are the artillery pieces being dragged through the mud. And of course, what they had to do is bring each different caliber of gun into position to cover the attack. So you had to carry your 18-pounders up, you had to bring the 60-pounders up, you had to bring in all the different types of artillery and get them in place, and they had to settle and they had to range their targets, or they'd be of very little use to the infantry attack that took place. Of course, they'd also be spotted by the Germans, because the Germans held the heights. So the artillery took very heavy casualties, and particularly they liked to use the gas shells against the artillery. And this was a very hazardous operation, but without the artillery, the infantry couldn't move forward. The Australians and Canadians had a fair competition going during the war, and during one of the official histories, it writes that the Canadians did the same as the New Zealanders. They were caught in the wire, with the exception that the Canadians managed to get through the wire. Getting through the wire meant you won the battle. Not getting through the wire meant you lost. And the Canadians were always able to deliver the goods, and this is really what Currie was known for. Their coordination and determination and their tenacity always seem to get through. And it's just remarkable, in every one of these battles, a handful of guys, one or two guys, are able to get through, and that's the difference between winning and losing.
6th of November, 1917. At 6:00 a.m., the 1st and 2nd Divisions attacked. Fighting fierce. Both were eminently successful, taking all of their objectives on time.
The Canadian battlefield, which of course extends from Bellevue over to Passchendaele Ridge, cost the Canadians 16,000 casualties, approximately 5,000 dead, just to go this far. But of course, this was typical of the Great War. In fact, you could argue that those casualties were actually quite low compared to some of the earlier ones that took place during this campaign. And the other thing is you lost men, but you achieved something. In most of these other cases, they lost men and didn't get through. They didn't have the victory. And that just makes the losses that much more worse.
It is true that at Passchendaele, our casualties were heavy. I gave the authorities an estimate of what our casualties would be, and I was within 200 of the right figure. We fought there 4 battles, and in each were eminently successful. I do not know which branch of the service is entitled to the most praise. The infantry, who stormed the hostile trenches and beat off the counterattacks, the artillery, who prepared the way for the infantry and who supported the attacks, the engineers and pioneers who made the roads which enabled the guns to be brought forward, thus making victory possible, the medical services who excelled all past performance in these battles, or the supply people in getting forward rations and munitions of all kinds. All gave evidence of the highest soldierly qualities and the determination to win.
The ruins of this church are one of the iconic symbols of the Great War. This is the church of Passchendaele Village. It was destroyed by concentrated artillery fire in November 1917. And on November 6, 1917, the Canadian Corps captured this position, the high point on the Passchendaele Ridge, and this added a little bit of light to what had been the worst British campaign of the entire Great War. Arthur Currie's planning and the execution and tenacity of the Canadians allowed for a small victory in the bleakest year of the war. By capturing Passchendaele, Currie had bailed out the British High Command.
Haig's chief of staff asked me if he might announce in the London press that Passchendaele had been taken. When I assured him it was in our possession, he uttered a fervent, "Thank God."
At the outbreak of war in 1914, Arthur Currie was an amateur soldier. By the end of the war in 1918, he had become the most successful general of the Great War. The boy from Strathroy, Ontario, defeated the Prussian military elite and outclassed the professional British generals. He had crafted a military machine, the Canadian Corps, to the highest level of efficiency. And it was during the last 100 days of the war that he won its greatest battles. We retrace his steps in the last 100 days of the war and discover how he won these victories and find out how he became the most famous Canadian of his time and why he was forgotten. I'm military historian Norm Christie. I've been touring the old Western Front for 30 years. By visiting the famous and not so famous cemeteries and battlefields, you'll get a unique perspective on the war and the men and women who fought it on the Great War Tour. We're driving through France near the city of Amiens. We're heading to the site of a battle, which is one of the turning points of the Great War. Nothing remains of the great battle except the small cemeteries in the farmers' fields that contain the graves of the Canadians who died there. This is Toronto Cemetery, and it's one of a dozen war cemeteries that marked the battlefield of Amiens. It was at Amiens that Arthur Currie had his first great victory of the last 100 days of the Great War. A lot had changed since Passchendaele in 1917. Under the leadership of Arthur Currie, the Canadian Corps became different. With a new attitude, they became a uniquely Canadian force. From over here, you get a great view of the battlefield. In 1918, the British Army decided to reorganize its divisions. In fact, they reduced their strength by 25%. Arthur Currie thought this was not the right way to go. He kept the Canadians at full strength and reorganized the battalions, adding men. Arthur Currie had constantly fought with the British on organization, on battle tactics, and usually he won his arguments. Currie was a pure operations man, and all he ever was worried about was efficiency. His argument about making divisions bigger rather than smaller is that you could use the structure that you already have, the organizational management that you already have, rather than going to more divisions and have lesser men in charge. He didn't feel they had the staffs there to make more divisions, because originally they wanted a Canadian Army with 5 divisions. Well, he wasn't up to this at all. He'd probably be the Army commander, but he thought the Corps, the way it was most efficient, and he did everything to preserve that operational efficiency. He added more engineers and more machine gunners, so a Canadian division was completely different than the British division. Secondly, there was a change in the culture of the Canadian Corps. They became very proud of their national heritage. They became proud of the Corps. They had a sense of pride that was unique to the Canadians.
The type of discipline in Canadian armies varied from that in European armies, where all classes were brought up with respect for rank amounting almost to veneration. This is an attitude totally foreign to Canadians, who are unaccustomed to showing deference to anyone who could not stand firmly on his own 2 feet without the artificial support of wealth or titles.
And this is why they were so strong when they attacked at Amiens. In the spring of 1918, the Germans had made their last great thrust to win the Great War. They'd advanced their front 60 kilometers in some areas, but they'd also depleted their men and left themselves extremely vulnerable. The Germans had faced the Canadians throughout 1917, and they had never won a battle. The Canadians had pushed them back at Vimy, at Arleux, at Frenois, at Hill 70, at Passchendaele. The Canadians had won every time. The Germans knew in 1918 the Canadians were out there somewhere. That meant there was a counteroffensive coming. Amiens was Arthur Currie's first great victory, and what he did here was simply amazing. He managed to sneak down a force of 100,000 men from Arras here to Amiens without being detected. So when they came down to Amiens, every soldier had in his paybook, keep your mouth shut, because this was going to be a surprise operation. And he used a number of techniques to do this, including sending some men up to Ypres, sending out false radio signals. He really deceived the Germans because he knew they were watching his every move. So the fact that he could get 100,000 men down here in secret was simply spectacular.
What worried me more than the actual operation itself was getting the troops and guns into position without arousing any suspicion on the part of the Boche. All movement for many miles behind our lines had to be carried out at night. The move was so hurried and the necessity of secrecy so urgent that many things which are normally done in preparation for an attack had to be left undone.
The problem with coming down here in secret and keeping the whole operation a secret was that Currie's men did not have an opportunity to reconnoiter the positions they would be attacking. They couldn't put the Canadians in the front lines because maybe a trench raid or something else, they'd find out the Canadians were there. Therefore, they attacked blind on August 8, 1918. Currie attacked with 3 divisions in the line, and he came across these fields. It's a pie-shaped battlefield, and it heads towards Amiens. And over here, you had the 2nd Division. You had your 1st Division coming across the fields we're on right now. And then to the south, you had the 3rd Division attacking. It had worked perfectly. They had caught the Germans completely by surprise. And by the end of the day, on August 8th, they had advanced 12 kilometers. They had captured 8,000 prisoners, 300-400 machine guns, 100 artillery pieces. It had been a complete success. In fact, the Germans called it the Black Day of the German Army, or the catastrophe of the German Army. And it was after this, the generals who were demoralized thought they should sue for peace. Later on, they changed their mind and they would fight it out for the next few months. But Amiens certainly was the turning point.
The Canadians renewed the attack on August 9th, liberating dozens of French villages, including Beaucourt.
This is Beaucourt New British Cemetery on the Amiens battlefield.
The Canadian graves here belong to the later stages of the Battle of Amiens and illustrate the enormous cost of the victory.
This is the grave of Major Leonard Drummond Hay, Military Cross, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. My great-uncle served as an officer in the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry from 1916 through to 1919. And only one of his letters survives, and it's about the action at Parvillers, August 14th, 1918.
The Frits were all around us. We tried to get to close quarters with them as they were among the buildings. The company commander, Major Drummond Hay, was putting up a fight when a bullet hit one of the men, went right through his stomach and into my knee. And I was just going to speak to Drummond when he fell like a log and said, "John, I'm done." I tried to get him to his feet, but he fell dead right in my arms. But today, the big attack has started again. I'll bet the Huns were wishing they had never been born, as our staff are determined to keep the Hun on the run.
My interest in the Great War cemeteries goes back 30 years. I was traveling through Europe, through France in particular, on the Amiens battlefield, when I came across a small, beautiful cemetery. And it contained all Canadians, and they were all killed 8th of August, 1918. And this made my curiosity run wild. I went around cemetery to cemetery, and each one was August 1918, August 1918. And this forced me to look at each cemetery as an historical event. And the men buried there gave you the details of that history. The graves here are all 9th of August, 1918, 9th of August, 1918, 9th of August, 1918. They're all Canadians killed in the Battle of Amiens.
From the north end of the cemetery, you get a great view of the Canadian battlefield of August 9th, 1918.
The Battle of Amiens was one of Arthur Currie's masterpieces.
The 3rd and 4th Canadian divisions pushed across these fields, but on August 10th, the German resistance stiffened.
After 2 days of fighting, on August the 10th, they hit an old trench system from 1916. It was German and French trenches, natural defensive position for the Germans. Currie tried to push his men through for 3 or 4 days, but when he realized the Germans were putting up a stiff fight and bringing in reinforcements after reinforcements, he decided that this was not a good proposition. He went to the general in charge, which was General Rawlinson, and suggested we call the battle off and we move the Canadians back up north. They then went to Douglas Haig, the commander-in-chief, with the same argument, and in the end, Currie prevailed.
16 German divisions have been identified, of which 4 have been completely routed. 10,000 prisoners have passed through our cages and casualty stations. 25 towns and villages have been rescued from the clutch of the invaders.
Two weeks after the Battle of Amiens, Currie's Canadian Corps were ordered to make another assault against the formidable German positions east of Arras. Their target would be the vital German transport center, the city of Cambrai. We're on the road to Neuville-Vitasse, and I'm going to try to find the location of the Canadian Corps headquarters in September 1918. They had followed the Canadian advance of August. Now Currie was moving them up closer to the front. Many of the historical locations associated with Arthur Currie are not marked. There is no way to find them except through primary research and poring over old maps, looking in the old books. There is nothing to indicate where this great man once served and where he made his greatest decisions. What I'm trying to do is locate the precise location of Currie's headquarters, and we have a few descriptions of it from memoirs, and we know it was somewhere along this road between Neuville-Vitasse and Wancourt, and it was in a muddy dugout area. It was not a very nice, not the chateau they were used to. It was in a muddy, sunken road, and I believe from all the locations we're going to find it just down here. So we have to cut up towards Wancourt and try to find Currie's headquarters. The map indicated there's a sunken road about 100 yards in front of us off to the left. And based on the description, this is where Currie's headquarters would have been. This is the location of Canadian Corps headquarters for the entire month of September. And of course, down here, you'd have all the communications, you'd have all the dugouts. You're still close enough for enemy fire, so you have to be very careful. But you can imagine this area, the transport going back and forth along the roads, communications to the other part of the sector, all down here. So troops are going in and out, ambulances, guns are moving up because they got to get much closer to the next phase of the operation. So this was a hive of activity. And this is sort of very cool that you're able to find such a neat location. The Battle of Arras began on August 26, 1918. As the attack moved on, Currie moved his headquarters up from Noyelles-Vion to here so he could be closer to the action. And it's quite amazing that the Corps commander is going to be this close to the front, and the divisional commanders are going to be even closer. So this sort of is a different world from, let's say, the Second World War. So they're moving up in this area, and this was a huge battlefield. This is just the first couple days we're seeing when you compare this to other Canadian battlefields. It's just huge. And of course, they're only attacking with 2 divisions. At Passchendaele, they attacked with 2 divisions, and it was this big. This thing is like 100 times bigger. And they're moving and moving and moving, and the Germans can't stop them. The first phase of Currie's offensive broke through a series of German lines. But casualties were heavy. 5,000 Canadians were killed or wounded. After 6 days of heavy fighting, the Canadians were preparing the last phase of the battle, the assault on the Drocourt-Quéant line. When you discuss the 100 days and the effect of the 100 days on the war, there's no doubt it shortened the war. And Currie himself was never clear which battle was the greatest, Amiens or Arras, but many people considered victory here at the Arras, the DQ line, as the greatest victory of the Western Front. I'm near the Arras-Cambrai road, and I'm looking for artifacts of the Battle of Arras, 1918. And here's a surface find over here. This is a big hunk of shell, and it was probably fired during the last phase of the Battle of Arras. It was to be Arthur Currie's greatest victory, the battle for the Drocourt-Quéant line. The Drocourt-Quéant line was a massive trench system built as an extension of the Hindenburg line. It had 2 trenches, 250 yards apart, and belts of barbed wire in front of it. It ran across this field just near the horizon, across the field and over. Currie's plan was to attack with his 4th Division between the village of Currie
and the main road. South of the road, it was going to be the 1st Division. And his idea was to break through this massive fortification. Currie's rule was you had to be within 500 yards of the trench before you'd make your attack. A wide no man's land was death. So what he had to do is get his men in place and beat back the Germans, because the Germans realized this position was critical. They were moving up specialist battalions to try to stop the Canadians. Currie's tactics, which he had formulated in the spring and early summer of 1918, was to deploy his engineers and his artillery to support his infantry. You have to remember their experience against the British in 17. These positions had held out for months. Now you've got the Canadians coming through here in hours. And at some point, the Germans, who had the Canal du Nord behind them, had to make a decision. Stay and fight and risk losing their artillery, or pull the artillery back and evacuate.
2nd of September, 1918. This morning at 5 o'clock, the Drocourt-Quéant was assaulted on a frontage of 7,000 yards. The 1st Division have pushed on. All our first objective was captured on time.
And by September the 5th, the Germans had pulled back to the Canal du Nord.
As a result of our victory yesterday, the hinge of the German system has been broken. It is a question whether our victory of yesterday or of August 8th is the greatest, but I'm inclined to think that yesterday's was. It was a glorious victory, and I am sure the people of Canada will be proud. Words cannot express the pride one feels in being associated with such splendid soldiers. The only regret one has, and it is a very sincere one, is that one has lost so many gallant comrades, men whom a young country like Canada could ill afford to lose.
These sunken roads often show evidence of the Great War. This one was used by British, German, and Canadian troops. And often, if you look in the side here, you'll find evidence of dugouts or somebody's been digging here. On August 26, 1918, the Canadians blew through this area, and shortly afterwards, the headquarters rolled through, and of course, with them came the war correspondents. And this is where they set up their Armstrong huts. It was during this operation that Currie showed a part of his personality nobody had ever seen. Currie was a very aloof individual to some. He was shy to others. He was 6'3". He was overweight. He was the only British general not to have a mustache. He didn't fit the symbol of a gallant major general. And to some extent, that affected him. But during these operations, when he was getting the casualty lists and thousands of his boys were being killed and wounded, he came to the correspondent's hut and broke down.
We were seated one disastrous day in our Armstrong hut, working our typewriters, when the door opened and General Currie stepped in. I saw in his face a story of tragic suffering. Without a word, he dropped into a chair and buried his face in his arms. His heavy body shook with sobs. After about 5 minutes, he regained his self-control, rose, and walked out. Once again, the grim soldier he had to be.
This beautiful sunken road is just east of the village of Quéant. In 1918, it had been a German command center. And on September 28th, Arthur Currie brought his Canadian headquarters here. The Canadians liked their new accommodations. They'd been built by the Germans as part of the support line of the Drocourt-Quéant line. They were 30 feet deep, they had canvas walls, they had everything the Canadians needed. But on October 14th, Currie got bad news. His best friend, Louis Lipsett, had been killed. Louis Lipsett was a regular British Army officer who had chosen to serve with the Canadians in 1914. He had served with distinction in every battle, 2nd Ypres, the Somme, Vimy, and Passchendaele. And he had been with Arthur Currie from the very beginning in 1914. The funeral procession for Louis Lipsett was a somber affair. It was attended by Julian Byng, Arthur Currie, the Prince of Wales. He had an honor guard of the 8th Battalion, which had been his first unit, and he commanded them at 2nd Ypres. There's elements of the 3rd Division, which he commanded for 3 years. He was Canada's unsung general of the Great War. And this is his grave. Major General Louis Lipsett, CB, CMG, Royal Irish Regiment, commanding 4th Division, killed in action October 14th, 1918, 44 years old. The inscription reads, "Out of the stress of the doing, into the peace of the done." Within 3 weeks of the Battle of Arras, Currie and the Canadians are once again asked to attack a formidable position. We're driving from Currie to the Canal du Nord, towards the final decisive battle of the last 100 days of the Great War. This is the Canal du Nord, and after the Canadian victory at the Drocourt-Queant line, the German army pulled back behind this position with the objective of protecting Cambrai, their most important transport and munitions hub. They had 3 or 4 lines of defense, and this is what Arthur Currie was faced with when he was given the objective of taking Cambrai. And now against the Canal du Nord, he had another problem. His line was blocked by a canal and 28 German divisions. So he was outnumbered, and he had a terrible obstacle in front of his advancing troops. So he came up with the strategic plan, which is probably his most brilliant of the entire war, and that was the crossing of the Canal du Nord. What happened in this area, for about 1.5 miles, the canal bed was under construction prior to the war, and it was dry. So Currie's plan was to use 60,000 men, hide them in the trees in behind here, and then in the middle of the night, launch an attack over the dry canal bed, pierce the German positions, fan out, and drive on Cambrai. He had a discussion with Julian Byng, his mentor, and Byng said, "Man, it's magnificent, but do you really think you can do it?" Currie had such confidence in his men that he knew that they could execute this. During the night of September 27, 1918, the Canadians launched their attack across the dry canal bed and drove towards Cambrai.
The attack on the Canal du Nord began at 5:30 a.m. Troops and guns and tanks have succeeded in crossing the canal. The fighting was quite severe in spots. We captured a German battery. Among the prisoners was a count. He paid a great tribute to the attack as carried out this morning, and stated further that in the German army, everyone agreed that the Canadian troops were most to be feared in all the Allied armies. We have overcome the obstacle of the canal, and in a few days should take Cambrai.
But like any battle, there was terrible costs associated with the victory. 1,000 Canadians were killed crossing the Canal du Nord, and they rest in 6 war cemeteries scattered in the farmland of the Nord region of France. These cemeteries are very rarely visited, and that makes them even more poignant. This is Quarry Wood Cemetery, and it contains 200 graves of men killed in the crossing of the Canal du Nord. This is the grave of an exceptionally brave soldier, Lieutenant Arthur Kilbourne, Distinguished Service Order, Military Cross, and Military Medal. 3 decorations for bravery, 2 as an officer, and 1 when he was in the ranks. Only 2 Canadians won this array of decorations. He finally met his end here at the Canal du Nord, September 27th, 1918. The first day of the attack had gone exactly as Arthur Currie had planned it. But over the next few days, German resistance would stiffen, and the Canadians would pay dearly to capture Cambrai. As the Canadians drove towards Cambrai, the Germans, desperate to save this strategic city, threw thousands of soldiers against the Canadian attacks. Finally, on October 9, 1918, the Germans were forced to evacuate Cambrai. But before they left, they looted the city and set it on fire. This is Canada Cemetery, and it contains 240 men killed in the final attempt to capture Cambrai at the end of September, October 1918. Arthur Currie's campaign had started off extremely well, crossing the Canal du Nord and pushing close to Cambrai. But as he got close to encircling it, the Germans threw in reserve after reserve. Finally, on October 1st, 1918, he threw in his depleted battalions in one last attempt to encircle the town and to drive the Germans out. A week later, under pressure from the south and the Canadian advance, the Germans withdrew from Cambrai, and Arthur Currie had his third great victory of the 100 Days.
The Germans have fought us here very, very hard, where we were counterattacked by 8 German divisions, all quite willing to die, coming right at us, determined to kill everyone if they could get through. And we were determined that we would kill every one of them rather than let them get through. I want you to understand what war is, and you cannot have war without the inevitable price.
This is the grave of Lance Sergeant G.M. Matthew, Military Medal and Bar. That means he won it twice. And he served with the 52nd Battalion, Northern Ontario Canadian Infantry, and he was killed in action in the final attempt to encircle Cambrai, October 1st, 1918, and he was 28 years old. It says, "A beautiful life, stainless and brave." Cambrai was the last great battle fought by the Canadians during the Great War. And for Arthur Currie, it was his third major success. For the Canadians at home, all they saw were the casualty lists, 42,000 names, including 12,000 dead. For in the newspapers, these were all listed as British victories. They never understood the importance played by the Canadians and by Sir Arthur Currie during these battles. So back home in Canada, he remained unappreciated. Going to the city of Valenciennes, which was the last Canadian set-piece victory of the Great War. After Cambrai, the Germans were essentially on the run, and they were looking for an opportunity to get a defensive line. And they tried to dig in around Valenciennes. And of course, Arthur Currie's Canadian Corps was going to take care of them, and that's exactly what they did. Currie brings up the artillery and literally blasts them out. They found over 800 bodies on the battlefield after they came through. Valenciennes is a very minor battle in terms of the 100 Days or the First World War. There's so many forgotten battles, and it's just one of them. This is Place de Canada in downtown Valenciennes. And today it's just a car park. But in 1918, it was something special. On November 2nd, 1918, the Canadian Corps had captured Valenciennes and liberated the people. As a consequence of this, they wanted to show some appreciation to the Canadians, so they named this square after Canada. Valenciennes had been Canada's last set-piece battle of the First World War, and it was a magnificent victory. They only lost 75 men killed and about 300 wounded. And they had taken over a city, very, very difficult terrain to fight in. It was Arthur Currie's masterful leadership that brought them to this great event. It was a great victory for the Canadians. After the fall of Valenciennes, the Canadians were ordered to pursue the retreating Germans to the city of Mons. The capture of Mons would be the crowning achievement of the Canadian Corps. The Corps had continuously gone against difficult German positions and drove the Germans back again and again, to a point that they were in full retreat. Now the Canadians had to keep pressure on the Germans up to the very last moment to make sure they signed the armistice.
German military power must now be irretrievably crushed. That is the end we must obtain if we have the will and the guts to see it through. We do not want to have to do this thing all over again in another 15 or 20 years.
During the assault on Mons, the Germans continued to put up a stiff fight, and 30 Canadian soldiers were killed on the last day of the Great War. And it's always difficult in the Great War, where you have just thousands and thousands of soldiers being killed, that the last few hold such significance. No one wants to be the last one killed in a war. This is the town square of Mons, and they're having a grand fete right now. On the morning of November the 11th, 1918, the Canadians received the news that the armistice had been signed. Soldiers of the 42nd Battalion, Black Watch, came into the Grand Place of Mons. Finally, the Great War was over. This is one of the few reminders of the Canadian liberation of Mons from the First World War. And it's a plaque that was put up right afterwards, and it commemorates the 50 months of occupation by the German forces and the liberation by the Canadians on November 10th, 1918. This is the original Mons monkey, and like any good Canadian tourist, I bought my own. But obviously, I'm not the first Canadian tourist to come here, and on November the 11th, 1918, the Canadian Corps, led by Sir Arthur Currie, led their victory parade through the Grand Place. And there were thousands of Belgians cheering them on. They had been under occupation for 4 years, and finally their day of liberation had come. For the Canadians, it was a grand finale for the 100 days. The capture of Mons was the last act in Arthur Currie's war. 30 Canadians have been killed in the attack, and they are buried in the civilian cemetery at Mons, not far from the Grand Place. This is Mons Communal Cemetery, and the Canadian graves are at the top of the hill.
10th of November, 1918. Both divisions reached Mons, where they encountered heavy machine gun fire. I gave instructions that if the town could be captured without many casualties, the pressure should be continued. Shortly after midnight, the 42nd Battalion entered the city. Some fighting took place through the streets, where I saw dead bodies later in the day. The German machine gunners defending the positions remained at their posts until they were either killed or captured.
This is the war graves plot in this impressive cemetery, and most of the Canadians buried here were killed at Mons, November the 10th, 1918. This is the grave of Tommy Mills, 42nd Battalion, Black Watch of Canada, Canadian Infantry, and he was killed November the 10th. Mills was a friend of Will Byrd, and in his memoir, Ghosts Have Warm Hands, Byrd recounted how Mills died the last night of the war.
Byrd. It was the voice of the company sergeant major. Harsh as a whipsaw. Get your section at once. Battle order. We're going to take Mons. Tom Mills and his brother Jim are on their feet. The war is over tomorrow and everyone knows it. What kind of rot is this? The sergeant major's face is pale and set. He was not speaking in his normal voice at all. Orders are orders. Get your gear. The Hun began to shell with shrapnel and tear gas. There was a despairing cry behind me. I swung around to see Tom Mills falling. His brother caught him, but he had to let him down. "I'm hit," Tom said, and held out his arm. But as he sank back on the floor, I saw he had a fearful wound on the stomach. He died as we looked at him. Jim Mills is wild-eyed. He says he's going to shoot whoever arranged to have his brother killed for nothing. He really means it. He's hoping Currie comes here today. If he doesn't, he's going to shoot the next higher up. He says his brother was murdered. An officer, Says, take Jim and get him drunk. So drunk he won't know anything for 24 hours. Then it'll be too late, and he'll forget all about it.
The capture of Mons was the crowning achievement for the Canadian Corps, and by Great War standards, casualties were few. But there's something different about the men who died the last day of the war, and those men would haunt Arthur Currie.
It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go. It's a long
This is the town of Cobourg, along the shores of Lake Ontario. And in the months after the war, Arthur Currie stayed in Europe, where he was feted by kings, royalty, and all dignitaries. Treated like the great general that he was. In August 1919, he sailed for home, and when he arrived at Halifax, there was no hero's welcome. The docks were empty. There was nobody there. And unfortunately, it was a sign of things to come. This is the War Memorial in Cobourg, and it was raised by the citizens of Cobourg to honor their fallen of the Great War. Most of those men would have been killed in the victorious campaigns serving with the Canadian Corps under Sir Arthur Currie. When Arthur Currie returned from Europe, there was a very strange reception from the government. They didn't treat him the same way as other generals. Most British generals got cash rewards. They gave him a lesser job in the military rather than the top job which he had deserved, and they didn't give him any official praise. It was a strange silence for a man who had done so much for Canada and so much for the Canadian government. The question is, why did the Canadian government treat Currie so shamefully? And we don't really know why, but we can speculate in a few areas. The first one is that the government and the Canadian public were war-weary, and they wanted nothing more to do with the war. The second thing we could speculate is political gamesmanship, because Sir Robert Borden was a conservative and Mackenzie King was the liberal leader. And both these men could see Arthur Currie as a rival, as Currie was such a famous Canadian and he had political leanings to both sides. But thirdly, and probably most importantly, the Canadian public and the Canadian government did not understand the importance of Arthur Currie's victories in the last 100 days of the war. His victories at Amiens, Arras, and Cambrai had shortened the war, and they were decisive and massive victories. But in the press, they were portrayed as British victories. All the Canadian public or the Canadian government saw was the enormous casualty list from the 100 days. 42,000 Canadian men killed, wounded, or missing. This is the campus of McGill University. In 1920, Currie was awarded the principalship of McGill University, and his office was over here in the Arts Building. This is the lobby of the old Arts Building at McGill. And in our search for the story of Sir Arthur Currie, we have found very little evidence of this great man. Here's an example here. Sir Arthur Currie, Principal of McGill, 1920 to 1933. We're going to go upstairs and find his office to see where he made a lot of his big decisions. We know from memoirs, particularly that of his secretary, and also from newspaper articles, that it's one of these doors on the second floor. And based on the location and other information, I believe it's actually number 210. It's now a student's common room. By the mid-20s, Currie was very dissatisfied at the treatment he and the Canadian Corps had received from the government. But it was really an article in a small-town paper that forced him to action. In 1928, he decided to sue to save his reputation.
There was much waste of human life during the war, enormous loss of lives which should not have taken place. But it is doubtful whether in any case there was a more deliberate and useless waste of human life than in the so-called capture of Mons.
This is the courthouse where the greatest libel trial in Canadian history took place. Arthur Currie was so incensed by the article in the Port Hope Evening Guide that he wanted a retraction. They accused him of taking Mons for his own glorification and of wasting the lives of his men.
It was the last day, the last hour, and the last minute, when, to glorify the Canadian headquarters staff, the Commander-in-Chief conceived the mad idea that it would be a fine thing to say that the Canadians had fired the last shot in the Great War.
He felt this was vicious and untrue, and he wanted a retraction. For some reason, the men in charge of the Port Hope paper refused to do so, and Arthur Currie was forced to sue for libel. And the trial started here, April 16th, 1928. The trial was a huge media event, and on the 11th day of the trial, Arthur Currie was called to the witness box. He was cross-examined for almost 7 hours straight, and nonetheless, he held his ground.
I don't know how we would have had the temerity to stop fighting on the 9th. We had done much, and we would have been the only corps to lie down and quit. Canadians do not lie down and quit within 2 days of victory.
When the trial finally ended, the jury went to deliberate, and after 3.5 hours, they found in Arthur Currie's favor. He had won another victory. Arthur Currie returned triumphantly to Montreal. There was much celebration and many congratulations. And there's actually a beautiful speech he wrote at this time, talking about how he had won his case, but he'd also defended his beloved Canadian Corps.
10 years have passed since we came home, and we have never been more united. Once more, we've come through a dirty fight, and once more, we've won. The Corps is once more united as it was in the fields of France and Flanders.
Arthur Currie was always a man of fragile health, and this trial took a great deal out of him. He was sick for almost a year afterwards, and he never truly recovered. Arthur Currie died November the 30th, 1933.
After a short illness of 3 weeks, he died in the Royal Victoria Hospital, Montreal. His body has been lying in state in Christ Church Cathedral. All day long, thousands of mourners filed past the bier to gaze for the last time upon the face of the dead. And leading men of Canada and citizens from many walks of life, all were present.
This is Christ Church Cathedral on St. Catherine Street in Montreal, and it was here on December the 5th, 1933, that Arthur Currie had his funeral service. After the service, his casket was brought through these doors, loaded in a hearse, and taken on up to McGill University. It would have been his 58th birthday.
The procession moves slowly up University Street. The students and the graduates are taking the body of their principal to the campus of McGill. There, the casket is placed upon a gun carriage. The Union Jack is draped over it. The naked sword and khaki cap are placed upon it. As the procession moves off, in front of the gun carriage is a full military escort for a general. With slow step beside them march the pallbearers, 8 generals, his brothers in arms. And for the last time, the devoted corps commander is in the midst of his devoted men. Immediately behind the gun carriage is the general's charger, with boots reversed in the stirrups, and the empty sword scabbard hanging from an empty saddle.
The gun carriage was brought through the Roddick Memorial Gates, which incidentally Currie had built in 1924. It's hard to imagine today, with Sherbrooke being so busy and so noisy, the silence of that December day. The procession had started at the Roddick Gates, come down Sherbrooke Street, and throughout there was a tremendous sense of affection and sadness for Arthur Currie. More than 200,000 Montrealers lined the streets. The military entourage was also exceptional. You had bands, and you had cavalry, you had infantry. They came up to this area, stopped here.
At Cartier Monument, the procession halts. With bared heads, the students, the veterans, and civilians take their leave.
And then proceeded up to Mount Royal.
And the sad journey to the place of burial is resumed. A great body of veterans following their leader for the last time. The gun carriage passes through the gates of the cemetery, and the body is borne to the grave. The mourners gather round. The chaplain takes his place.
By the time the procession arrived, the light was failing, and there were hundreds of mourners already in place. And then it came time for the committal service. The casket was taken from the gun carriage and brought over the grave. The archdeacon read the committal service, and Arthur Currie was lowered into the ground. They then played the last post, followed by reveille, and the great general was gone.
Then, as the body is committed to the ground, I heard the solemn words of the service for the burial of the dead.
We therefore commit his body to the ground, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust.
Arthur Currie was the most outstanding general of the Great War. No one came close to his successes, yet he remains unknown and ignored. To me, he was a military genius, and he was our genius. And it's about time he got the credit that is due to him.
The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace, now, forevermore.